It was 30 minutes past midnight on May 11th, 1997, at the Bright Angel Lodge. The lodge lobby was dimly lit with a sense of urgency hanging in the air. Clifton Reeder, a concerned soul, rushed to the lobby phone. His voice trembled as he reported an unusual sight to the Grand Canyon National Park Service. An intoxicated woman outside, but this wasn't just any woman. She was perched atop the rock wall behind the lodge, insisting on climbing. Yet on the other side of the wall was not a climb but a steep drop. The dispatcher who had answered Clifton's call broadcast the same message over the park radio, echoing the message, "Help needed." Keith, a National Park Service ranger at the Grand Canyon in northwest Arizona, was at the scene in a few minutes. He stood in the empty lobby nervous. Directed outside, he followed the path to the rear wall overlooking the Grand Canyon. There he found Clifton, the caller, eyes wide, pointing into the darkness below. "She's over the edge," he urgently whispered. "You must help her." Imagine standing on the edge of a vast chasm, the Grand Canyon, a geological marvel carved by time and the relentless forces of nature. The air is thin and the silence hangs heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional echo of a bird's call. The wall itself is rugged and imposing, its ancient layers of rock telling stories of eons gone by. Jagged edges jut out, their rough surfaces etched with the memory of countless sunrises and sunsets. The colors shift, a palette of reds, oranges, and browns, as if the very earth is breathing. The wall stands as a barrier, guarding the abyss below. Its height is dizzying, and the ground drops away abruptly, revealing a sheer drop into the heart of the canyon. Ranger Keith followed Clifton's frantic gestures and looked down the wall below. He strained his eyes. There was nothing but tree branches and darkness. Then from the depths, a voice, a desperate plea. "Help me." Ranger Keith's flashlight confirmed her presence. It was Lana Virginia Smith, age 28. The ranger knew her from occasional cookouts in the area. From their current position, it appeared that she had slipped down the steep rock on the inside of the canyon and was only a few very dangerous feet above a sheer cliff. In a light blue shirt, she was sitting perched on a narrow ledge on a steep, eroding slope. The ranger's mind raced. How to reach her? The slope below was too steep, unstable, a descent of danger. He couldn't risk it without a lifeline. A rope, maybe, or a helping hand. "Don't move," the ranger told Lana. "I'll find a way to help you." Alarmingly, Ranger Keith saw that not only was Lana intensely sobbing, but she was so upset and unstable that she posed a major risk to herself. At the sight of the ranger, her cries intensified, echoing off the canyon walls. Time ticked without mercy. The ranger acted quickly. He walked along the wall, eyes fixed on Lana, looking for a better approach to reach her. He scanned the terrain, seeking a path, a lifeline, before it was too late. Then Lana shifted her body, only so slightly. She slipped downward by a few feet, or about a meter. Rocks and debris dislodged and fell into the canyon below her. A scream from her was followed by the ranger's calming and reassuring voice. She was scared, and she wanted to get out of there. At 12:40, 5 minutes had passed since Ranger Keith's arrival in the lodge lobby, when a second ranger, Donnie, joined him. Ranger Donnie knew Lana as well. It was quickly agreed that Ranger Donnie would take the full-time role of talking to and calming Lana, while Ranger Keith came up with a plan to get her with a rope before she slipped further down. Ranger Donnie climbed over the wall and found himself on a steep, eroding slope. The soil and rock below him shifted ever so slightly, but he continued to reassure Lana, while scanning for a safe way to reach her. Ranger Keith, over the radio, requested immediate assistance from a technical rescue expert, Ranger Michael Nash, and an additional ranger to assist. They were on their way. It was evident that Clifton, the original caller, was in too much distress and his presence was not needed atop the wall. Keith accompanied Clifton down from the wall, where he explained to the ranger the events that led to his emergency call. Lana, apparently, had been dealing with child custody issues. Her ex had just been given increased visitation rights. 3 shots and 2 beers later, she was denied service. She was too drunk. Lana reacted in agitation and headed for the wall. Worried about her safety, it was then at 30 minutes past midnight that he made the call to the National Park Service. Right after the call is when she slipped. Ranger Keith moved back up the wall, hoping that Ranger Donnie would be able to keep Lana calm enough until they could secure her into a rope. Then a second scream pierced the air. Keith rushed to look. Ranger Donnie, not protected by rope, had begun slipping inches down slope. However, he was okay. But Lana had again tried to move and had slipped and slid further down towards the edge of the cliff. Lana's situation now looked even worse. She lay on her back in the dark on the steep slope, now 50 feet or 15 meters below the wall, clutching loose, rattling gravel between her fingers. The friction between her body and the slope was also getting weaker the more she got tired. "Hold on, don't move." Ranger Keith was back on his radio telling Ranger Nash to hurry. At 12:52 a.m., Ranger Nash arrived with his technical gear. Lana had been on the slope for 22 minutes now. They were running out of time. Ranger Nash secured a high-strength anchor to hold the rope they would use to go down and get her. Lana's life was on the line. At this moment, she was laying half on her back and half on her side, gripping a small tree extremely close to the cliff's edge. Her cries for help echoed in the darkness, merging into desperate screams of terror. At 1:04 a.m., the fourth ranger, Matt, arrived on the scene. He began to buckle himself into his rappelling harness. Once geared, the rope would attach from the anchor to his rappelling harness and he would descend. As Ranger Matt geared up for his descent, there was fear in all their minds. Ranger Donnie, who was further below on the slope, had a rope thrown to him. They feared that there might not be enough time for Ranger Matt to get down. He yelled to Lana, "Catch this rope." While encouraging the hysterical Lana, he gathered the slack of the rope in his hands and tossed it. But instead of catching the rope, Lana slid downward towards the edge, the rocky debris clattering into the abyss below. She didn't stop though. The few feet remaining between her and the edge disappeared, and just as she slipped fully over the edge, a miracle, she managed to grab a fragile bush that was clinging to the soil with both hands. Her knuckles widened as she held on, out of breath. Ranger Donnie, who had thrown the rope, watched in horror. He tried to scramble down slope. It was the slippery and steep terrain and darkness that stopped him 10 feet or 3 meters short of being able to grab Lana. Lana had slipped over the edge and was almost invisible. Her body dangled. She was caught in a dreadful situation. She held on to the stunted bush, her screams swallowed by the void below. In her current state, screaming and holding on to the bush with both hands for dear life, she either didn't notice the rope the ranger had tossed down to her, or was too scared to let go of the bush to grab anything else. Ranger Matt, now half harnessed, began to go down the wall towards Lana. It was at that moment that Lana's last visible hand vanished, leaving only her desperate cries echoing in the canyon. Rocks tumbled, then silence. It was like the cliff itself held its breath along with all four rangers. Ranger Keith's flashlight swept the edge, revealing nothing. Lana was gone. Half-harnessed Ranger Matt rappelled down fast. They all hoped for another miracle. At the end of his 150-foot or 45-meter rope, he was over the cliff. He dangled in the dark in search of Lana. She had fallen way farther than his current position. The four rangers had run out of time. Lana had run out of time. They had been a short time and a short distance away from rescuing her. Ranger Matt ascended back up the wall. Then two of the rangers descended farther down over the cliff. They found Lana, 230 feet or 70 meters below. It was her body. The canyon had taken her. On November 28, 1992, Greg visited the south rim of the Grand Canyon with family and friends. The day started off like any other family outing, with laughter and enjoyment filling the air. It was a day that would end tragically. The group walked along the Grand Canyon Rim Trail, a path that hugged the edge of a steep drop into the canyon. Halfway through the trail, they split up. Plans were made to meet up again at the parking lot. It was Greg and his daughter who walked the furthest and ended up being the last to turn around to head for the parking lot. Greg's young daughter walked beside him. They had a good relationship, and father-daughter banter was common during their interactions. Sure, Greg's jokes were dad jokes, and not always funny, and even though Alexis might have rolled her eyes in response to them on numerous occasions, she still loved them as much as she loved her dad. As they walked along the rim trail, enjoying the breathtaking views, Greg decided to play a practical joke on his daughter. With a cheeky grin, he climbed onto the rock wall that separated them from the canyon's vast depths. Dramatically pausing at the top of the rock wall, he faked losing balance, windmilled his arms, looked at his daughter, and yelled, "Help! I'm falling." Then in a defiance of gravity, he jumped backwards, towards the inside of the canyon. As usual, Alexis rolled her eyes. She was used to her father's antics. "Oh, Dad," she said impatiently. She continued walking down the trail. She wouldn't entertain her father's pranks. She knew her dad would pop out of nowhere any second now. But by the time she reached the parking lot where everyone else was waiting, there was no sign of Greg. He was the only member of the group missing. Worry on their faces, the group retraced their steps along the trail. 2 hours later, the sun began to set. Their concerns grew. The Grand Canyon National Park Service was contacted, and the Park Service initiated a missing person search. Returning to the section of the wall where Greg had been goofing around, they found nothing. The search team then looked over the edge of the rim, and to their relief, they didn't see a body. It was at this time that they couldn't help but wonder, how much longer did Greg plan on continuing his prank? They expected to find him lost off the trail, feeling a bit embarrassed about the prank. It was only when the sunset turned into night that the search and rescue team really became worried. They deployed a helicopter equipped with special tools, infrared sensors which detect heat, and a powerful searchlight. Their mission: find Greg. The helicopter closely scanned the area along the south rim. There was still no sign of him. Finally, Greg's jacket was spotted by search and rescue rappelling down the rock wall, about 400 feet or 120 meters below, where he had been fooling around. It was wrapped around his body. The morning after, Ranger Ken Phillips examined the scene, his gaze fixed on the very section of the wall where the father had last been seen. Standing at the top of the wall where Greg had been standing revealed a narrow ledge right below, about 3 to 4 feet or 1 meter wide. As Greg faced his daughter and made the fateful jump backwards, his intention was to land on this edge. Based on the scuff marks found, Greg's shoes met the ledge, but his footing betrayed him. Perhaps it was loose gravel or a deceptive tilt. But whatever the cause, he lost his balance, somersaulting backwards into the canyon. As he fell backwards, limbs flailing, control over his body was out of his hands. The world spun in a disorienting blur of stone and sky. He died during or after his 400-foot or 121-meter drop. At around 9 in the morning on July the 8th, 2004, Margaret Bradley and her new running partner jogged down the Grandview Trail in the Grand Canyon. Old friends from Chicago, Ryan had recently moved to Flagstaff, Arizona. His first order of business was getting to know local running and hiking trails, and he wanted to introduce them to his old acquaintance Margaret. The weather at the rim was similar to Flagstaff, with temperatures slightly below 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Both runners had made acclimatization runs over the past few days to prepare for today's run, which was important because the Grandview Trail sat at 7,400 feet or 2,250 meters above sea level. The acclimatization runs helped with altitude adaptation, temperature tolerance, fitness, and endurance. Despite this preparation, there were a few problems. Ryan had only carried a gallon or 4 liters of water for himself. Margaret, on the other hand, carried fruits and a couple of protein bars, but only had a gallon or 2 liters of water for herself. Also, neither of them had a map, headlamp, or a satellite phone in case of emergency. Not to mention that no one else knew where exactly they were going. Lastly, they started their run after 8 a.m., 3.5 hours after first light. Experienced canyoneers know that the smart hour to start search journeys is before sunrise or even earlier. This was especially true in the hot July summer. If the runners were planning for an hour-long run, their timing or water supply would not be an issue. It was Margaret's first time at the canyon, and Ryan, who hadn't hiked the Grandview Trail in years, had guessed the distance of their route to be about 15 miles or 24 kilometers long. Their running route from the Grandview Trail was on an unmaintained path that could transform well-trained legs during a run into jelly. Even worse, the route Ryan had picked was not 15 miles or 24 kilometers long. Had any of them taken a few minutes to properly check, they would have found that their route covered more than 28 miles or 45 kilometers. Margaret trusted Ryan. 15 miles or 24 kilometers was a long training run. Yet, this was the hottest time of the year in a normally hot place. In this sun, an active person can sweat up to 3/4 of a gallon or 4 liters of sweat to keep cool. By 9, the temperature on the trail ahead of them was close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius in the shade. It would be even hotter once they got there. The Grand Canyon National Park Service even had recommendations for anyone attempting their chosen route. The park's website noted 2 things. The route is not recommended during the summer, and that there are no reliable water sources on the trail. The combination of open sunny country that lacked shade and was extremely dry made this route dangerous in hot weather. Halfway down the trail, a surge of alarm rippled through Ryan's veins as he realized that Margaret had carried only a fraction of the water needed to quench her thirst. In fact, she had brought only a quarter of the water she would need. At this point, Ryan should have insisted that they turn around and head back, but they didn't. By 1 in the afternoon, they had been jogging for hours, and Ryan had finished his last drop of water in Gatorade. The same with Margaret. As the sun was at its peak and the temperature rose, Ryan's body was losing a battle against the heat. He already felt exhausted and overheated. You see, our tiny sweat glands produce sweat to cool us down. When it's hot or when we're active, they kick into gear. But during extreme heat, they can get overwhelmed, struggling to keep up. When we sweat excessively without drinking enough water, we become dehydrated. Dehydrated skin sweats less, reducing our cooling ability and making overheating worse. Sweat isn't just water. It contains essential electrolytes like sodium and potassium. Losing too many electrolytes disrupts nerve and muscle function, contributing to overheating. The symptoms of heat exhaustion include weakness, dizziness, and heavy sweating when our body can't cool itself efficiently. If ignored, it can escalate to heat stroke, where core temperature rises dangerously high and sweating stops. Not dealt with, a person could develop vital organ damage, unconsciousness, and even organ failure. At the 15-mile or 24-kilometer point, they were about halfway through their route. Ryan collapsed under the shade of a large rock. He just needed to catch his breath. Then they would continue to the South Kaibab Trail and hike up to the rim. 2 hours and 30 minutes later, the two were still under the shade, even more dehydrated than before, with the closest source of water 5 miles or 8 kilometers behind them off their current trail, which they had jogged past. They were in a terrible situation. Their decision-making had so far been guided by Ryan's original incorrect running plan. By that estimation, the junction for the South Kaibab Trail had to be close by. They agreed on a new plan. Margaret would continue the trail, take a detour down the South Kaibab Trail to Phantom Ranch, and arrange for help for Ryan. Margaret's head was currently in marathon mode. She had run 15 miles before, many times. She could do it again, even on this hell-like terrain. Whatever you do, Ryan told Bradley, don't get off the trail. The Kaibab Trail will be obvious. Statistics show that when hikers in trouble decide to split up in emergency situations, survival dips dramatically. Margaret Bradley jogged on, the temperature a moderate 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius in the shade. The path she was on was shadeless and dry. The solar heat now radiated from the ground to the point that the air seemed to shimmer. The hot arid air was sucking her dry. She expected the Kaibab Trail to appear at any moment, but the trail was 10 hot hard miles or 16 kilometers further. Margaret had ran 15 miles or 24 kilometers before. She knew what it felt like. So when the terrain along the trail became more confusing and chaotic, she knew something was amiss. Unbroken cliffs surrounded her. At 18 miles or 30 kilometers on the trail, she crossed the bone-dry Lone Tree Canyon. From here, the Colorado River could neither be seen nor heard. She realized that Ryan had been wrong about the routes and the distances. She just didn't know by how much. She didn't know where she was or how far she needed to keep going. After watching Margaret run ahead, Ryan struggled to his feet. He began to follow her footprints. About 3 hours later, the dark made it impossible to see her footprint or even the trail itself. With no headlamp or map, he stopped, collapsed on the ground, and spent the night on the trail. He lost his contact lens. Hours earlier, Margaret had covered this same ground, desperate for water and in a panic. She was heavily dehydrated, and she knew she could not go on for much longer. Without water, she would die. Ryan would die. Before the sun rose, Ryan was on his feet. He started walking along the trail. He still recognized the prints left by Margaret's running shoes. As he passed Cremation Creek, 21 miles or 35 kilometers into the route, he was amazed that Margaret had managed to jog this far. He was lucky today. The temperature was lower than the previous day. He followed Margaret's footsteps all the way to the junction of the Kaibab Trail at 25 miles or 40 kilometers into their route, or at least He thought he followed them. It was shortly after that he found an emergency phone. It was out of order. At 6:30 in the morning on July 9th, a U.S. Geological Survey employee heard Ryan's screams of help. She spotted the exhausted and heavily dehydrated Ryan. Ryan told her he was weak and in desperate need of water. He still had a hike back to the rim. While she didn't have enough water for the two, she pulled out her satellite phone and called the Grand Canyon National Park Service. They were directed to an emergency water cache. The Phantom Ranch ranger, named Ivan, later noted that nowhere in the conversation did we get information on the incident or that Ryan and Margaret were runners. As of now, Margaret Bradley was not yet a missing person. Officially, she didn't even exist in the park. Ryan drank water, ate some snacks, and rested for a couple of hours. He still assumed that the strong and smart Margaret was at Phantom Ranch. At 9 a.m., Ryan began the 10-hour hike to where they had started their run. He was escorted by his rescuer. Within an hour, they met a canyon hiking guide that Ryan was familiar with, escorting clients down to the Bright Angel Lodge. Ryan asked the guide to get a message to the woman he was hiking with, a Margaret Bradley. Tell the ranger to tell her I'm moving her car from Grandview to the South Kaibab trailhead area. That was all. Details of their near-death experience were not shared, nor did Ryan express any concern about his friend's whereabouts. At about 4 p.m., Ryan reached the start of their route. He again asked the ranger to relay the "I will move the car" message to Margaret. The radio crackled to life, explaining that a hiker wanted to get a message to a Margaret Bradley at Phantom Ranch. They responded in the affirmative, followed by questions on whether Ryan was okay and if he required emergency assistance. The answer to that was no. For the next few hours, Ivan, the Phantom Ranch ranger, asked around about Margaret Bradley during his campground checks. No one had seen or even heard of her, except for the hiking guide who had forgotten to relay the earlier message. Hearing her name now, he informed the ranger about the message. "Anything else? Was everything okay? Do you know where she is?" the ranger asked. But the guide could not provide any additional information. The ranger continued asking around. At 7 p.m. that evening, 12 hours after Ryan and the USGS worker met, the two were at the parking lot. Ryan vomited. His nausea and the loss of his contact lens convinced him to change his mind on the plan to shuttle Margaret's car closer to Phantom Ranch. Instead, he got a ride home to Flagstaff. He still didn't know where Margaret was and assumed that she was at Phantom Ranch arranging for his rescue. It apparently never occurred to Ryan to wonder if Margaret had made it to Phantom. Why did he not hear from her or anything about an attempted rescue? On the way to Flagstaff, they stopped to eat. A milkshake and a Coke after, Ryan vomited again. Finally in Flagstaff, he offered to buy his rescuer dinner. She declined, asking Ryan one last time if he was sure his friend was okay. He said he would check on Margaret as soon as he got inside by calling her via the Phantom Ranch number later. He hosed the vomit off the side of her car and entered his house. But at his house, exhausted, he fell asleep on the floor. He woke up at around midnight and drank a smoothie his roommate made for him. Margaret's location was still a mystery. He still assumed she was at Phantom. He went to bed. Early on the same day, July the 9th, in the afternoon, Margaret Bradley's family arrived in Flagstaff to meet her. When she failed to show up that evening, her brother contacted the Flagstaff Police Department at 11 in the night to report her missing. None of the family members knew where she was last seen, but it must have been somewhere between Flagstaff and the Grand Canyon. They began making systematic calls to lodges and motels around Flagstaff. Still, nothing. After midnight, they contacted the Grand Canyon National Park Service. The dispatcher, who had just started their shift, hadn't heard of Margaret Bradley. By now, past midnight, the July 10th, at least 19 hours had passed since Ryan was helped by the USGS worker and 35 hours since him and Margaret had split up. Ryan was asleep. In the morning at 4:53 a.m., around 38 hours after Ryan and Margaret had split up, Margaret Bradley was officially listed as a missing person. It was right after that Park Dispatch called the Flagstaff police as soon as someone found the note that someone named Ryan had left about moving Margaret's car. A phone call woke Ryan up from sleep, and soon enough, police were at his door. It was now 40 hours after he and Margaret had been separated. It was during the police interview that Ryan finally felt a surge of concern. At 7:30 a.m., Park Dispatch finally learned of Margaret's last location. Soon after, at 9, the park had 20 park personnel working on the search. At 11:28 a.m., Park Helicopter 368 began its search from east to west over the trail. 30 minutes later, the helicopter crew spotted a person wearing a white t-shirt lying in a dry water drainage leading off the trail. Hoping to see movement, the helicopter got as close as possible. The crew now saw that it was a woman, her hair whipped into a frenzy by helicopter blade wind. But the woman herself did not move. The rescuers found Margaret Bradley curled up in a fetal position as if she was sleeping. After running the scorching 22 miles or 35 kilometers on only half a gallon or 2 liters of water, she had cradled her head on her fanny pack. Her cause of death, dehydration stroke heat exposure, about 12 to 24 hours earlier. The specific date of her death was July 10th, shortly after midnight. Ryan had met the USGS worker with a sat phone about 30 hours before Margaret's body was discovered. To save you some quick maths, Margaret Bradley had been alive at the time, and she would continue to wait and hope for the next 7 to 19 hours after Ryan had walked past her. As in her search for water, she followed the water drainage and jumped down a pour-off that she could not climb back up or down from. After leaving Ryan on July 8th through sheer strength and willpower alone, she kept up pace under conditions that would have stopped most other people in their tracks. Yet, no amount of training could get her past the heat and dehydration. As she pushed onward at 5 to 6% dehydration, her circulatory system became compromised. Her body was not transporting blood, nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hormones through her body efficiently. If she continued exerting herself at 10 to 15% dehydration, equivalent to 2 gallons or 9 liters of water loss, this would trigger a sudden death through heat stroke. If she stopped to rest, then the level of dehydration would lead to a slower, yet inevitable death. While jogging along the trail on the afternoon of July 8th, Margaret Bradley had become vastly depleted in her total body water. Dehydration took control of her and her ability to think. She was dying. Her instinct to survive drove her to head downhill towards water. She followed a now dry water drainage off path. Her detour was only 3 miles or 5 kilometers before the junction for the South Kaibab Trail, where Ryan would be rescued later. A half-hour walk from there, she would be standing at the Colorado River, and during those minutes she would have encountered other hikers, just as Ryan would 12 hours later. Instead, she detoured, then descended the deceptive soil carved into her drainage by heavy rainfall many years ago. She committed to this route by jumping down a pour-off she could not climb back up. She next stared downward in shock at an impossible 130 feet or 39-meter dry waterfall drop-off. She had trapped herself about 500 feet or 152 meters above the Colorado River, where the air sizzled at 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. She required rescue, specifically from someone trained in rock climbing techniques. She could only hope that searchers would find her in time. Evidence suggests that she tried to use the flash of her camera as a signaling device on the first night. She most likely stayed here for at least 18 hours, but possibly more than 30 hours. Alive but severely dehydrated, hoping for help before the heat and dehydration killed her. It's hard to imagine the thoughts running through her head. Margaret Bradley's story is used to warn of the dangers of the canyon through flyers on the trails at the Grand Canyon up until today. Titled, "Could You Run the Boston Marathon?" one of Margaret's impressive achievements. It tells her tragic story. If you made it this far and enjoyed the video, subscribe. I'll see you next time when we face our fears together.